some of their legendary literature and some of their fanciful tales and some of the things that make up some of the fictional things that incorporate that are part of a lot of people's literature that we just never get to talk about, right? So I want to kind of jump into that and talk about that, because we've been talking a lot about the Fourth Dynasty. So we've talked a lot about Khufu and Snefer, who started the Fourth Dynasty, and Khufu and his son Khafre and the Jedfre and Menkaure. We've talked about several people of the Fourth Dynasty and the building of the Great Pyramids. But how did the Fifth Dynasty start? How do we kick that off? And we're going to talk about it from a more, I guess, serious sense, if you will, in a more historic sense. But there is a fanciful tale that is historical, that it's a part of ancient Kemet's history and a part of his legacy that talks about this transition from the Fourth Dynasty to the Fifth Dynasty. So as we jump into that and kind of jump into that whole tale, it has a lot to do with Khufu and a lot to do with magicians, and we're going to jump into this. When we think about the Fifth Dynasty, as we think about, just to set up some things to get you some perspective there, as we think about the Fifth Dynasty, we're talking about, 2400 BC, 2465 to about 2323. That's the Fifth Dynasty. And there are some important things that happen in the Fifth Dynasty. There are some very important people, especially toward the end of the Fifth Dynasty. There's some very important people. But the first few people in the Fifth Dynasty, Userkaf, Sahure, and Neferirkare, these are some people who jump out in history as well. There's some significant things, and they are, a lot of times, sometimes you may see this, you may Google this, and you may look this up, but when you see, Sahure and Userkaf, sometimes people refer to them as being father and son, but a lot of the legends refer to them as being brothers, right? So sometimes people say just because Userkaf was the starter, if you will, considered to be the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, it doesn't always necessarily mean that was a dad, right? In the tradition that we'll talk about now, in this particular legend, has them as brothers, and some of the other traditions have them as having the same father of Menkaure, who was the grandson of Khufu and the son of Khafre, that his offspring, his direct offspring, was the last king of the Fourth Dynasty. And then there was a switch, that he had several sons, in particular the first three sons, but really the first four sons in particular, but the first several sons of the Fifth Dynasty and the several kings of the Fifth Dynasty were actually and supposedly sons of Menkaure, the grandson of Khufu, the builder of the third Great Pyramid. And so as you think about that, it's not always that it's father-son. Sometimes it's other family members, and it may be a succession of sons who become the kings, if you will. So, why did that happen, and why was that considered to be a shift? There's considered to be a shift in the Fifth Dynasty because there is a significant emphasis put on Ra. So we start to see Menkaure and Khafra. We start to see different things like that in terms of the pyramids and references to Ra. But you begin to see it jump up even more in the Fifth Dynasty. You begin to see sun temples, and you begin to see Ra very prominently used in the king's names. And as I mentioned to you, each king had several names that they went by. Usually they had more than one name. Well, by the time you get to the Fifth Dynasty, their 5 names are being used kind of regularly. And one of the main names you hear them kind of adding regularly is son of Ra. So you see Ra becoming very prominent in the king's names and in the sun temples they would build, which we will talk about, and some of the architecture and religious things that they push forth in the Fifth Dynasty. So why did all that happen? So that seemed to be like a significant thing, and it was considered to be by some historians, early on or later on in history, however you want to look at it, as a significant enough change to look at it as a different era, as a change, if you will, in some of the focus with respect to ancient Kemet and with respect to its kings, right? So as we talk about that, we're going to be talking about these first 3 kings of the Fifth Dynasty, who were apparently brothers, and actually maybe the first 4 kings were brothers. But there's a legendary tale that talks about them and talks about how they became the kings of the Fifth Dynasty and where that came about. And obviously, the term dynasty we use in a later sense. It wasn't something they used at the time. It was something that was put forth in a later sense by Manetho, but it was put forth in a later sense. But it was still considered to be a significant change. So, something different happened. So how did that happen? There's a legend, and the legend is called Khufu and the Magicians, and we're going to talk about that legend today and kind of walk through, what does that legend say when it comes to the starting of the Fifth Dynasty. What does that say, and how does it kind of move forward? So it talks about Khufu, who, as you know, is the builder of the Great Pyramid. And Khufu apparently is in this tale, and this tale was probably written down, or the papyrus, which is called the Westcar papyrus, that they got this tale from, was a part of several different parts, several different tales of this one story, if you will, that's kind of framed together. And it was something that was probably written during the first intermediate period, after the Old Kingdom fell, and just before the Middle Kingdom during the fell, or even maybe a little bit later than that, maybe even during the second intermediate period when the Hyksos were in power. So it may have been written even later than that, than the first intermediate period, but it was dated to probably the Middle Kingdom, maybe written in Middle English, so in the Middle Egyptian. So you have a situation where this tale survives and comes down to us from a period of time that's much later than the actual time where it took place. But it's a legendary tale about King Khufu and the person who built the first Great Pyramid. And it comes from probably the second intermediate period during the time of the Hyksos. And it goes back and kind of looks back at history, right? And the tale begins to give an offer an explanation as to how these first three kings came to be and who they were and what they were. And we're talking about Userkaf, Sahure, and Neferirkare. So we're talking about how they came to be and what they were doing in terms of how they were able to be born and how they became king. So this tale is kind of interesting to think about. And the tale goes that, Khufu is sitting around one day and he is actually in his chamber. And he calls his sons. He calls his sons Khafre and his son Bufere, and as well as Hardedref, who we've talked about, who was the sage. He calls his sons before him and his officials, and he says, you know what? I want you to tell me stories of famous magicians. Tell me about the wonderful things that our sages and the wonderful things that are magical people who had special powers and connection with God. Tell me things that they've done. Show me some of the things that they've done. And so several of his sons get up. Two of his sons get up, including Khafre, builder of the second Great Pyramid in this legend, and he tells them stories about things that happened in his dad's time when King Sneferu, started the Fourth Dynasty, the man who started the Fourth Dynasty, what he did and some things that were done to entertain him, some magical things that were done with water. And they go on these long discussions. And then finally, his son, who is considered to be a sage in the later parts of ancient Kemet, whose name is Hardedref, he gets up and he says, Dad, all these people have told you about things that had happened in the past, about great people in the past. I'm going to tell you something about a magnificent man who lives right now today, who you can see today, who lives right in your territory, right in your kingdom. He's a man who's an older man, but he's a man who is an amazing man. He can eat like 500 loaves of bread, and he can eat a half an ox, a day, and he can drink 100 jugs of beer. He is someone who is magical. He can take the head of anything that's been cut off and severed from the body and rejoin the severed head back to the body. He can make a lion walk behind him and obey him without carrying on any type of leash, or he can do those types of things. He's a magical man, and he can also tell you the secret chambers, the number of the secret chambers of Tahuti. Now, if you think about it, because I like to draw religious significance and spiritual significance from the stories that we find in history. You think about Tahuti, and we've talked about Tahuti being wisdom, right? And according to the story, Khufu, I'm getting this as an image of Khufu here, Khufu wanted to find the secret chambers of Tahuti, the secret chambers of wisdom, so that he could replicate that in his tomb and mimic the secret abode of Tahuti, if you will. We know that Tahuti is God's wisdom. It is God's plan. It's God's plan manifested in your life. So Khufu wants to mimic that in his tomb. So Khufu says to his son Hardedref, if you know who is this guy, send me this guy, bring this guy to me so that I can find the secrets of Tahuti and the secrets of Tahuti's chamber. And so his son goes off to find this Jed, this priest, and his son finds him, and his son goes and travels south. And he finds this wonderful priest. And this wonderful priest is someone who, as I mentioned, is someone who has magical powers. He is someone who is able to do amazing things. And he's a little bit older in this depiction, but he's able to do major things and magical things. And when when the king's son comes to him, he says, I need you to come back. I'm going to bring you all these wonderful things. I need you to come back to the palace. When we come back to see King Khufu, he needs to know something from you. So this magical man comes back with all of his wisdom and all of his powers, and he comes back before King Khufu. And King Khufu says, I hear that you can do magical things. I hear that you can sever a head. A head can be severed from his body and you can put it back together. Well, let's see if we can do that. And at first they were going to use a person, but Jed tells King Khufu, no, let's use an animal. You want to see this? Let's use this with somebody who's not a person, somebody who's a divine person of God, because all of God's people are God's creation. Let's use an animal instead of that. So they bring in a duck or a goose or something like that, and they chop the goose's head off and they separate the goose. The head is over here and the body's over here on the other side of the room. And then Jed, the magical man, the man with these magical powers, he says his special words and he brings the body and the head together, and the body gets up and finds the head and it joins together and is magically put back together. He does this several times in front of Khufu. And Khufu says to them, well, you're amazing. I hear that you know and that you understand secrets as it relates to Tahuti. I hear you know the secret chambers and the amount of secret chambers that Tahuti has, the wisdom that's behind that. I need you to tell me how many chambers does Tahuti have in his secret abode so that I can mimic that. I need you to give me that secret. And Jed says to him, I can't tell you that. I can't give you that information. I don't know the exact number, but I know where it is. It's in a magical place in a chest. It's in the northern part of Kemet. It's in a place that's being protected in the city of Anu, but I can't give it to you. And the king says, I don't get this. You know what? If you know what it is, why can't you give it to me? Tell me where this is and give it to me. And the man says to him, he said, King, wonderful king, the person who is going to give you that information that you seek is going to be a son of Ra. Is going to be a child that is right now in the belly of a woman who is married to a priest of Ra. And she has 3 children that she's going to bear. She's pregnant with 3 children, and those 3 people will become kings of the Kemet. They're going to rule this land, the land that you now rule. And and what he's talking about Userkaf, Sahure, and Neferirkare. And this is the legend about their birth. And King Khufu is kind of upset, and he goes, wait a minute, what do you mean they're going to rule? I mean, my sons will rule. Are you saying that my legacy is going to come to an end? And Jed says to him, King, don't worry, because your son is going to rule, and then your son's son will rule, and one more person after him will rule. But eventually, the king's land, this land is going to be ruled by sons of Ra, and they will come into kingship. And so Khufu's a little upset. But as he's talking about, you can tell that this legend is speaking to some historical things, because obviously Khafre ruled after Khufu, and so does Menkaure. So they're saying that Khufu's children will still rule, but these new people are going to come, and they're going to end up taking over his line, his legacy, and it's going to be sons of Ra. And so the story then switches, and then King Khufu says, okay, wait a minute. So if we're going to have this woman and the children that are in her womb, and the firstborn of her womb, of her children, will give me this information. Where is she? Who is he? Who is she? And her name was like Rudat or Rudat. And he said, where is she? And he said, well, she's in Anu, which is in the northern part of Kemet, which the Greeks call Heliopolis. So in the Bible it's called On. But that's where the priest of Anu, and that's where the priest of Anu, and that's where the priest of Ra were in ancient Kemet. It says she's in Anu, and she's married to a priest there, a priest of Ra, and she's going to have a baby, and he gives the date that she's going to have her children. Well, Khufu was like, well, we have to find where these children are. And so the story switches. It switches from them talking about Khufu and talking about the court, if you will, and it switches to Ra. It switches to Ra being in heaven, if you will. And we talked about Ra being an expression of God, that aspect of God that is life force. And you're talking about now a period of time in ancient Kemet's history where you're going to really see more prominence of Ra. And this legendary story kind of speaks to that. You're going to begin to see Ra become more prominent. You see Mentu prominent before this. You see Ptah prominent, you see Atum, and then after this you see Amen prominent. But this is the time that Ra will become very prominent in kings' names and in kingships. So they have in a story, Ra is talking to Aset, and he's talking to her sister Nebhet. He's talking to 4 goddesses. He's talking to Aset, he's talking to Nebhet, and he's talking about to the goddesses who help to bring in children into the world and to put souls into children. He's also talking to Khnum. And if you remember, Khufu's name has to do with Khnum. Khnum protects me. So it's an interesting thing that they talk about Khnum. And he says to these goddesses and to Khnum, go down to earth, find my children that are about to be born from you and give birth, usher them into the world. Help my children be born into the world. So Ra, as an aspect of God, as an aspect of the creator God, as an aspect of a God that is that life force, tells Aset and Nebhet and the women who are in control of childbirth to go and to find this woman and to bring the children into the world. And so they go with Khnum, and they dress up as women who are dancers for the temple. And they come to the man's house who is the priest of Ra, and they tell him that they are from out of town, they're traveling, and he's kind of upset. And he says, well, I can't really talk to you too much right now because my wife is in there and she's having a baby and she's having a difficult time. I think she has more than one baby. She's having a difficult time in childbirth. And they say, don't worry about it. We are women who understand childbirth. We know how to bring things into existence, if you will. Let us go help her. And he says, if you guys know what you're doing, come in. And he lets them into his house, and they go into the room where the mother is, and they shut the door. They lock the door and they shut it behind them, and they keep him out. And then all of a sudden it's on, right? Aset She gets in front of the mother, and Nephep gets behind her, and the women kind of take over. And the women begin to usher these children into life. They begin to usher them into life. And Aset says to the first child, who will be Userkaf, he says, don't stay in there and cause any trouble or war in your mother's womb. Come into life right now so that you can be the powerful person that you will be. And then the first child is born. And as that first child is born, it's like just a beautiful thing. He's born, the baby is born, Userkaf is born, and the goddess of childbirth, the goddess who helps to give you your ka and your soul, hovers over the baby and says, you will be a king of Kemet. You're going to be a king of Kemet, and you're going to be a powerful one. And then Khnum comes over and strengthens the baby's limbs and makes the baby strong and gives the baby the strength he would need to be king. And then Aset goes back to the mother, and the women surround the mother, and she says to the second child, who will be Sahure, she says, come forth. You are somebody who's going to tread down many people and tread on many things in your life. Don't tread in your mother's womb anymore. Come forth into life and be the king that you will be. And the second child comes out and is born. And the goddess, who is goddess of childbirth, hovers over the child and says, and pronounces to him, you will be king of Kemet, and you will go forth and be a great man in this area. And Khnum takes the child and gives the child strength and puts strength in his bones and strength in his eyes and strength in his limbs. And then the third child is about to come, and Aset goes to the mother again. And she said, you who is sitting in darkness in your mother's womb, don't hide in darkness inside your mother's womb. Come out into the light, come into the world, for you have many things to do. And the third child comes, and that third child is Neferirkare. And she brings him into the world. And the goddess, who is the goddess of childbirth, hovers over him and says to him, you too will be a king of Kemet, and you will rule this land. And Khnum goes to that child, and the child is taken and is put into and given strength. And so then you have the three children there, and they are basically ordained to become kings of Kemet. And this is kind of the story as to how they were born. It talks about them. Now the babies are there. They're healthy, all set, and the women who are in charge of childbirth give the children what they need in order for them to be strong, in order for them to be able to go over and be good leaders in Kemet. And then they leave out the room, and the father, the priest of Ra, who's the husband of the woman, he says, what happened? And she says that you should be happy, be proud. You have three very strong, wonderful boys who are going to be very successful one day. And they leave. And he says, wait a minute, I have to give you something. You've done such a wonderful thing. You helped my wife out. You help our family. Let me give you something. They're like, nah, there's nothing really you can give us. He gets a big bag of barley. He says, let me give you this as a gift. Take this barley over to the brewing house, and maybe they can brew something for you, and you can have it as a gift. So the women start to leave. They take the barley. Khnum takes the barley. And as they're walking away and they're about to go back to Ra to tell Ra that they have given birth unto his children, they have made sure his children have come into the earth and had everything they need, Aset, like the leader she is, like the woman she is, she said, how dare we come to earth, to this place, and deliver Ra's children and not do something special for them? And then they decided to get together and to form the red crown of Lower Kemet and the white crown of Upper Kemet in a special way for these children, so that each of the children would have their own diadems and their own crowns that combine the red crown and the white crown of Upper and Lower Kemet together. And they take it and they put it inside the bag of barley. And they take it back to the man's house, back to the priest of Ra house. And they said, keep this for us as a secret. Lock it up. Don't let anybody see it. Keep this for us. And later on, we'll come back and get it. But don't let anybody get into this bag of barley, because we have to go somewhere. We have to travel. So the man says, whatever you want. He promises. He takes the bag. He locks it up. He puts it in a room. He puts it away so that nobody can get it in the storage room. And that's where it stays. And then a couple weeks pass by, and the mother who had the children, she is recovered now from childbirth, because apparently it was a traditional 14 days of recovery. She's recovered, and they're about to have some type of celebration. And she tells to her servant, her handmaiden, her maid, she says, is the house prepared? And the lady says, yes. The young girl says, yes. She said, well, is the beer made? And she said, no, everything is ready but the beer, because the barley is being kept locked and key by your husband, being kept under lock, because he's promised it to the women who help you have childbirth. And the lady says, the mother says, well, go get the barley, go get the bag. We'll use it and we'll just replace it later. And he can give them what we replace it with. So the little girl goes in to get the bag. And when she opens up the room where the bag is, she hears noises, and she hears sounds, and she hears singing, and she hears like praises and celebrations for a king. It's like a celebration for a king. She hears noises coming from the bag, and it ends up being that her and the mother get into an argument, and the mother yells at the girl and beats her, and the girl runs away, and the girl tries to seek help from her family, but her family also rejects her and beats her, and the girl gets taken by a crocodile. Like, that's literally how the story ends. It literally ends with the girl who found the bag and was going to get the bag being running away and something bad happening to her. But at the end of the day, the story represented the birth of the three kings of the Fifth Dynasty, the three first kings, Userkaf, Sahure, and Neferirkare. And so Neferirkare. So it begins to be a significant thing, and it's really what we have in terms of existence, in terms of how that transition took place. And we obviously know that it's a legendary tale and it's a fanciful tale, but it's a remarkable tale that gives you some idea of the legendary and the type of stories and a type of folklore that was in ancient Kemet. And every country, every people, every society develops its own folklore, and they look at significant people and develop stories around them. And this was a way from a standpoint of folklore, to introduce the first three kings of the Fifth Dynasty. So we're going to go on now and talk more about, in future episodes, we're going to talk more about who these kings were and what they did from a real historic standpoint. But I wanted to share this story about Khufu and the magicians and why it kind of ushers in the first three kings, Userkaf, Sahure, and Neferirkare. So I hope you have a good day. Thank you so much for listening, and please share this with somebody. God bless you.